Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
It's a clash of the tax titans on this episode of A Nation of Taxpayers, the podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance. 4 people with 2 minutes each, all outlining their most hated tax. They then cross-examine each other, and at the end of this session, if we get through it in good time, they each vote on which tax is the worst, but they're not allowed to vote for their own tax. That's how it works, and if it's a tie, then I have the honour of doing the casting vote. In the TPA studio this week, we have the following gentlemen. Maurice Cousins from Net Zero Watch, welcome.
Bonjour.
Good to see you. Benjamin Elks in the TPA, hello Ben.
Good to be with you, Duncan.
Max Marlow from the Adam Smith Institute / the Director of Policy at the YIMBY Institute. Have I got that right?
YIMBY Initiative. But,
YIMBY Initiative.
It's close enough, thank you, Dan.
It is. I'll try and edit this out later. And also Callum McGoldrick from the TPA as well. Welcome.
Great to be back on.
Right, gentlemen. Usual sporting rules apply. No fisticuffs, please. Well, we'll try and get this underway in a civilised fashion. And we're going to do this in alphabetical order of surnames in terms of people going first. So, Maurice, you're first up to outline your most hated tax. You get 2 minutes. I have a bell here to start the proceedings and a bell here to finish the proceedings. Let's just make sure it works. Right, okay. Your time starts now.
Jolly good. Okay, so I am today going to campaign. I'm advocating for what I sort of consider to be a tax on modernity, which is the emissions trading scheme. Now, technically speaking, in legal terms, this is not actually a sort of tax, it's a permit system. But in economic reality, it is a tax. You are compelled to pay to emit, and the money flows straight to HM Treasury. So what is the emissions trading scheme? Well, so the UK has been a member of this scheme since 2005, which was established by the European Union, and then we created our own one in 2021. And essentially what this is that the government sort of sets an allowance for how much carbon certain sectors can sort of emit each year, and currently that is about 936 million tonnes over a period from between 2021 to 2030. That's been set up by the unaccountable and elected Climate Change Committee, and it creates a sort of series of sort of permits which sort of decrease each year. It's levied on a number of sort of different sectors, so it's primarily it's aimed at sort of energy intensive users, so manufacturers. But also electricity, power generators and the aviation sector. And essentially, you buy permits. The idea behind it is that it sort of creates a sort of a market mechanism. But what's disastrous about this, obviously, is that it sort of has a horrible ripple effect throughout our economy. Raises about £3.6 billion a year, which is sort of less than how much we spend each week on the NHS. But it's sort of the damage that it does is disproportionate and ripples through. I'm up to 5 seconds, so I'm done, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Hey! Thank you very much.
Hello.
Job done there. Good work. Okay, let's move on to our next willing contestant, who's Benjamin Elks from the TPA. 2 minutes. Ben, and your time starts now.
Yes, so for me, the tax I hate most is insurance premium tax. Now, for those who might not know, this is a tax applied whenever you purchase an insurance product, essentially, with a few exceptions, but for the most part, it applies to most insurance policies. It raises just shy of £9 billion. So, despite the way some politicians may speak nowadays, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's by no means sort of the big raise, one of the big raises of income. There are 2 rates. You have a 12% rate, which applies to most insurance products that people will use, so home insurance, most car insurances, pet insurance, that sort of thing, and a higher rate for things like travel insurance and electrical appliances, that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, my big problem with it is that it is a tax on doing the right thing. If you're going to be responsible and try and protect yourself, you are penalised for doing so. So if, for example, you take out travel insurance to protect yourself against medical bills overseas, you are penalised for doing so. If you take car insurance, for example, you are legally obliged to have car insurance as a driver, and you have to pay a tax for the privilege. Or if you take something, for example, you're often sort of penalised for state failures in some regards. So an example would be if you insure your mobile phone. Just the other week we had the ridiculous case of Currys on Oxford Street putting down warnings that this is a phone snatch zone. So a failure of policing. If you're then taking out insurance to protect your gadget, save you an unhelpful cost, you are paying for the privilege to make up for a failure of the state to protect you from thieves. So it's a disgraceful, immoral tax that we should do away with.
Good work, thank you. Next up is Max Marlow. You have 2 minutes. Let me just adjust your microphone ever so slightly. There you go. 2 minutes, your time starts now.
Thank you very much, Duncan. So I am campaigning vociferously against stamp duty land tax, which has been around since the 17th century, first imposed during the Regency period to fight, Napoleon Bonaparte. Back then it was levied on newspapers and different stamps, as the name gives away, and therefore to land deeds and mortgages. Back then, individuals like James Mill, Father John Stewart, and even the great Adam Smith rallied against such taxes on transactions. James Stewart said it was essentially a censorship tax in the form of, in the form of the taxman, whereas Adam Smith railed against it for its terrible problems of slowing down transactions. That hasn't really changed, unfortunately. It's bad for three primary reasons. First is how it's collected. It's collected in cash as a direct payment to HMRC within 14 days of a property transaction, usually by the seller. That means you need to raise additional money on top of the deposit in order to pay it. That adds additional strength to the market. The second area, it slows down housing velocity, and during a housing crisis, that is terrible. We saw when the stamp duty holiday during COVID came in, housing transactions rose by 140%. So there's quite clear empirical evidence that this slows down people getting onto the housing ladder and slowing down as well labour market movement, which is especially poor as the regions are very unequal nowadays. And the third area is actually a bit of an appeal to authority. They also have it on Australia, where they conducted the Henry Tax Review. They found it to be meritless. Likewise, the IFS's Mearley's Review also found it to be meritless. It is a terrible, terrible tax, only raising 14 billion. And, fundamentally, it is one of the main causes of the housing crisis outside of mass migration and our failure to build more houses. It can be very easily replaced with a property tax, as they do for the rest of the world. So, boo to the SDLT and up with the property tax.
Good work, thank you very much. Right, and then finally, we have Callum McGoldrick. You ready?
Yep.
Okay, 2 minutes as normal. Your time starts now.
So my most disliked tax, and the one I want abolished, is inheritance tax. And it's not just me, it's actually a majority of Brits as well. It's Britain's most hated tax, with 55% of people polled wanting it either cut or abolished. And every group, except those with a PhD, said it was Britain's most unfair tax. Why is this, you think? Well, when it started, it was brought in at very high levels and very few people actually paid it. In fact, and with so many caveats, so many people could get out of it. In fact, the Labour Chancellor, Roy Jenkins, said it's a voluntary levy paid by those who distrust their heirs more than they dislike inland revenue. But what's the problem now? Well, the rates at which you pay it, the threshold at which you pay it, has been frozen since 2009. Through fiscal drag, this is dragging more and more and more people paying into it. The average liability now across the entire country is 150,000 per estate. Out of eligible estates, this is more and more people being dragged into paying it, and it's more and more of the middle class being dragged into paying it. If through clever accounting, if you can afford that, all good luck. If you manage to survive 7 years after gifting, you won't pay it at all. That's just one of the many, many, many exemptions that are brought into the tax. And I think when you look at a tax and say, well, the best argument against it is that it's easy to get out of, why have it in the first place? Why not get rid of it? Similar to Ben's tax, it raises a very modest amount, about 8.5 billion a year. That's less than 1% of the entire tax income. It's really insignificant in terms of how much it earns. And to finish my point, it started in the medieval era under Henry III in the form of feudal dues. Henry was known for weak leadership, financial mismanagement, and giving away English land. It's perhaps no wonder that Keir Starmer's such a fan.
All right, excellent stuff. Thank you, gentlemen, for very convincing arguments there. Let's move on to the part of this where you get to cross-examine each other. We'll do our best not to talk over each other. We have a good chunk of time for this. And Maurice, as you went first, making your pitch, you're in the chair, so to speak. So anyone want to pick up on any of the points Maurice made?
I will. How do you suppose we tax these externalities such as carbon, sulfur dioxide, etc., without such a permit scheme? Because this is important. Things should have a price in all circumstances. So, how does one internalise that negative externality?
So I think that the way that we deal with this, I think the most important thing for us to remember here is that the UK is only really responsible for about 1% of sort of global emissions, and there's no way of escaping this, which is that climate change is real, it is man-made, etc. But this is a global problem, and really what we're doing here is we're not actually, changing the fundamentals. These are materials and industries that we rely on. You've got people like Václav Smil, the polymath and sort of scientist who refers to a lot of these industries as sort of the pillars of modern civilization. You're a YIMBY and housing advocate. One of the things that we need to be doing is to bring down the costs of housing. Material costs have risen significantly since I think 2015, and are set to rise even further by 2030. So we need these industries. All we're doing is we end up sort of offshoring a lot of these jobs because those industries will just go overseas, and then we still need to be able to have the materials that sort of come here. I would much rather see greater emphasis and focus on, rather than trying to sort of tax this activity, on how we can incentivize more cleaner energy production, whether that be around things like nuclear, and thinking of new innovations in other materials. That's how I would rather deal with it than sort of taxing modernity out of existence.
Are you convinced, Max?
I'm convinced. I think it's a very good argument. One thing I will ask, though, should we also be, if we're going to tax, if we're going to put a price on carbon, should we also put carbon tariffs in place? If it's all being made in China and the Philippines and India, surely, we should be able to tax those and maybe have a fairer system when it comes to trading with these countries.
I'm going to say actually no. I think a real problem that we've got at the moment is that a lot of these sectors are proving to be very, very difficult to sort of decarbonise, and the reality remains that if you do tax these things, all you end up doing is exacerbating things like the cost of living crisis, which a lot of people don't really appreciate this, but it is by far and away the number one concern for British voters at the moment, more so than the NHS and actually immigration. And we can't escape it. We need things like steel. We need things like cement. We need to be able to fly and to connect around the world. And so by introducing things like carbon border tariffs and stuff like that, really all you're doing is regressing. It's anti-progress. So no.
All right. Any more questions for Maurice? Remember, this is your opportunity to convince other people around the table with your piercing questions in order to maybe shape the vote.
You said it was the Climate Change Committee that issues the permits.
I think it's the Treasury that issues them. It's the Committee on Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee that sort of sets the overall sort of target. Yeah.
Would you be happier if there was sort of no Quango involved at all? Would that make the tax more palatable? Or still just want it gone?
I mean, obviously, I would like to see. I mean, we're amongst friends here. I think yes, I would like to see the unaccountable, unelected CCC gone. I don't think it would make it any more palatable. I think that ultimately, if we all care about saving the planet, the market will determine whether or not we are prepared to spend money on products that are harmful. That would be right.
Right. Any more questions for Maurice? No? Okay, let's move on to Ben. You are second, making your pitch. You're now in the chair. Questions towards Ben regarding the tax he wants to scrap, which is the insurance premium tax. Any observations? Any questions? The silence is deafening.
I think I've
You won. Should we just wrap up the podcast and go to the pub?
I will say, remind me, is VAT chargeable on insurance? I don't think it is. So I think that's the question, right? So if we want an equal and fair tax system, which you hear from Tom Clougherty, for example, formerly ASI, formerly CPS, now at the IEA, who does advocate for broadening the base on VAT. Should it not make sense to have that same tax on services? And even then, the higher rate for IPT, I believe, I think it's about 12%, or is it 16%? But nonetheless, it's sub 20%. Do you not think, if we want a fair and consequential tax system, should we not therefore have 20% on insurance products?
So the standard rate is 12% and the higher rate is 20%. Mm-hmm. But it's a bit of a false equivalence. When you pay VAT on a product, you have that product to use and to enjoy. Insurance is different in that you don't want to use it. You don't ever want to realise the benefit of that product. It's more akin to taxing someone when they put a deposit into their savings. If you imagine the premium, your insurance premium, as money going into your savings account, every time you made a contribution to that, we don't apply tax to that. It's putting something aside for the rainy day. That's all your insurance premium really is. We don't apply that to bank deposits, so we shouldn't apply that to insurance premiums.
Any more for any more? Anyone fancy playing devil's advocate with Ben?
It was quite a compelling game.
It is a compelling game. And I think it affects all of us one way or another, doesn't it? I was struck by what you said, that actually you're being penalised for effectively doing the right thing, which in some cases... I'm not trying to influence the vote here, it's just an observation. But in some cases, legally, you have to have car insurance, right? So you can't not pay this particular insurance. You don't need pet insurance by law, but you need car insurance. So you're hammered for doing what is the right thing.
And you can take it a step further and think of things like if you take out private medical insurance, you will be saving the NHS money. You will not be using their services. You will be saving taxpayers' money, and yet you are still charged for the privilege of doing so.
Right, next in the spotlight is Max with stamp duty. Max is in the chair. Who's going to go first and interrogate him with his policy?
Would you want stamp duty replaced with just a transaction tax on properties as well?
Oh, definitely not transaction tax. They are pretty dreadful. So what I'd rather have is actually a land value tax. I come from the Adam Smith Institute, and it's one of the three primary modes of production, that being labour, land, and capital, that we don't actually tax that much, or even at all. If you look at, for example, the council tax that is levied on property values from the early 90s. Likewise, stamp duty is valued on anywhere above 125,000 at quite a low rate, up to $1 million and $3 million. So I'd much rather have a tax on the land, which seems much more fair and also much more easy to decipher than what we have at the moment, which is a terrible transaction tax. And we know from research from my own institutes that stamp duty is 8 times more damaging to the economy than even VAT is, which is 4 times as damaging. So I really am concerned about the transaction tax.
So you, in your statement before, you mentioned sort of introducing a more general property tax. Mm-hmm. How and when would that be levied, and how would you calculate it and base it?
Well, what you can do is you can take the kind of general value of land, and then you ascribe, I'd say, about 2% of that value of land, to be paid annually, and you could actually roll in council tax to that as well. So you replace the entire system. I think it works much better. If you look at, for example, all over Europe they do it. Germany, France. Look at Hong Kong, for example, which has very limited amounts of land. They're quite good at allocating that kind of tax. It's more done on income there, on rents and arrears, all the way through to California, North Dakota, Wyoming, Canada. The world has moved on from what is a 17th century tax, which doesn't do very much, but only damage the economy. So there's actually a lot of consensus around it. I mentioned the IFS earlier. I've spoken to people at the Centre for Taxation who, they're not our friends, I'd say, in the tax world, but even they recognise it's absolutely terrible. I've spoken with quite left-wing Labour MPs. They think it's terrible. And, of course, people in this room should, of course, agree, and listeners to the podcast should agree. SDLT is also a terrible, terrible tax. So there's consensus it's terrible. Why not just get rid of it?
I have a question. I thought it was a very compelling case, obviously, but I have a question around whether or not abolishing it, whilst we've got serious supply-side constraints, it would also stoke demand.
Well, so it's a very interesting question. So I actually wrote a paper on this a couple of months ago with the YIMBY initiative, arguing that we should do an exemption for new build properties. The reason for that is because of velocity. So when you're building, I don't want to get too much into the development scope here, but when you're building new housing estates and towers and whatever else, you need to be able to source finance and able to do it, and you must be able to execute and sell those properties within a limited scope if there's a closed cap fund. The problem with SDLT is because it gums up the housing market so much, you can't therefore reprocess the finance, and you can't therefore build more houses. The knock-on effects are really significant. There was a study done from LSE a few years ago, which asked new homeowners, what is it that stops you from buying sooner? 40% of people said it was stamp duty. Interesting. I've spoken to housing developers. What's one of the big problems? It's stamp duty. I've spoken to developers, financiers. What's the problem? Stamp duty. There is consensus across the housing scope that this is a really serious problem. So it's less about stoking demand, because at the moment, demand is really it's really quite limited because it's so expensive to move on. So you can see why Tories and even some in Labour want to push for stoking demand. But the best way to do that, and I have a bit of sympathy with the developers on that particular area, is to do the supply side reform by abolishing the tax. So that's how I would move forward with that. There are lots of reasons, of course, why stoking demand is always a bit questionable, especially in there's such a gummed up supply. But if you want to build more houses, you need to sell more houses. If you want to build more houses, you need to sell more houses. And if you're stopping the buying, you're stopping the building as well.
Happy with that response?
Yes, I think broadly.
Right. And finally, Callum, you're in the chair here. So the cross-examination begins regarding inheritance tax. Who would like to go first?
I've played devil's advocate here. I mean, again, another powerful case that was put forward. But I suppose the obvious sort of redact to what you were sort of saying is, what about inequality? And how, that there is an argument to be made that inheritance tax makes us a more...
Yeah, Callum, we need to redistribute the wealth. That's basically what Maurice is saying. So as we put on different hats just for the sake of argument in this podcast, why is this unfair? Why do you want to stop people getting a bit more in life?
Yeah, well,
those who don't have it but deserve it.
I think...
You nasty Tory.
I think we can all see that there's a big problem in that the major problem with this is that the thresholds have been frozen since 2009, meaning just taking the value of it at 2009 when it was still an awful tax. If you bring that to now, the lower threshold would be over 500,000, meaning that it's not the super wealthy that are being taxed under IHT anymore. It's the middle classes, overwhelmingly so. And it's especially those that can't afford the mechanisms to get out of paying it because there are so many exemptions. When you view things like this, it's small business owners, it's farmers that have all of their assets tied up in their actual business that pass it on. People inherit it. Before they can pass on their wealth, you've got people in their 40s, in their 50s putting away this fund. That means they're not investing in their business. It means they're not hiring new staff, all because of this one tax. That's not making a fairer society. That's just making the middle class terrified over having to pay this tax out of fear of losing their business.
Yeah, pretty good answer. Anyone else?
Can I shapeshift quickly into Thomas Piketty and maybe Gary Stevenson? This tax only really affects 5% of the population. You've made the good case about the fact that it's avoiding it's difficult, but the rest of the taxes around the table you can't really avoid. If you want to buy insurance, which is, as you said, mandatory for drivers, can't get around it. If you want to buy a house or even a commercial property, you've got to pay stamp duty. If you want to buy anything industrial from Britain, you've got to follow there. When it comes to that, it seems quite easy to get around. So what's the problem,
Well, I
Callum?
think it's 5%. It's 5% of estates. So, and that's going to, by the end of this parliament, that's going to rise to almost 10% of estates. One estate is obviously passed on to multiple people. France has a system where you pay inheritance tax based on the amount you actually receive rather than the value of the estate. We have it where whatever you receive, you still have to pay it based on the estate. So that's 150,000 more families by the end of Parliament having to pay an increased rate of IHT. So it's not just 5% people, it's an awful lot more than that. I think when you look at, is it avoidable, it's like, well, yes, if you're lucky or you can afford the lawyers. But then if the argument for keeping the tax is that it's easy to get out of, well, we're no longer arguing about if it's a good or valuable tax now, we're arguing about something completely different.
All right. Any more cross-examination of Callum?
I've stopped being Thomas Piketty, so it's
Okay,
okay.
you stop shape-shifting. All right, brilliant. I'm just going to ask all of you just to give one line as to why people should vote for your tax, and then we'll get down to the voting. So we'll do it in the order that we started. So Maurice, in a sentence, or possibly two, but no more, why should you get the vote?
I think that this is a stealth tax on energy and industry, and it's what I would say a low yield but high harm tax.
Okay. Benjamin.
Insurance premium tax is a tax on doing the right thing. It's immoral and penalises you for being responsible.
Max.
Look at the data. When there was stamp duty holiday, 140% increase in transactions happened. If we want a wealthy, actually progressive society, abolish stamp duty land tax.
And Callum.
It's a tax on having the misfortune of dying, and the families that are left with it are often in their most bereaved state when they're having to deal with the bills.
Brilliant. All right, let's get down to the voting. Maurice, who's going to get your vote?
God, this was a difficult one. I mean, it was all being a big TPA fan.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go Callum and axing IHT.
Okay. Ben, who's going to get your vote?
I'm going with Maxwell for the stamp duty land tax.
Stamp duty. All right. People can't see this. One day you will be able to. But I'm making notes here on a scrap of paper just in case I cock it up. Max, who's going to get your vote?
I think it's going to be Ben, because actually I'm a big fan of what's called the insurance theory of everything. Everything should be insured and regulation should fall away from it. I think it should be on Lloyd's to set our regulatory policy and not the government.
Okay. Callum, who's going to get your vote?
I'm going to go for Maurice, as I think it's...
Oh. Have you colluded to do this to make sure that I get the casting vote and end up hacking off 75% of the people in here? Is that what the plan is? So what's your reason?
I think it's ridiculous that the government spends so much of its time and energy creating quangos to regulate something that we have such little impact over on a global scale.
Yeah. Right, as you probably worked out, if you've been paying attention, there's a vote for every tax there to be cut, which means I get the casting vote. And this puts me in a very difficult position. But I think I'm going to go... Well, it won't come as a great surprise to me. It's a toss-up between the inheritance tax or the insurance premium tax.
TPA people.
I know. I knew you would say that. I'm
Bloody Stitcher.
Duncan is a fair, reasonable
I'm an impartial journalist, obviously. That's why I'm here. So I think I am struck by, and I alluded to it earlier, the idea that particularly car insurance, which you have to have by law, that you're going to get hit by the IPT, and I just think that's wrong, and that actually encourages people to drive around with no car insurance.
Exactly.
And that affects a lot of people, because that means that I could get hit by some, can't think of the word I want to use, some oink who's decided not to bother because they might say it's too expensive, and that's going to impact on my life. Though I accept all of the other taxes that you brilliantly all pitched to be scrapped, impacts on all of us. So I think, Ben, you get it.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much. Anything you want to say regarding your various organisations? I'm looking chiefly to you, Maurice, and to you, Max, because you've been our guests here at the TPA. Anything you want to share with our listener?
We've got some interesting sort of reports that are sort of coming up very sort of soon. I can't divulge them at the moment, but they're going to be around sort of like issues relating to sort of like liberty and energy. If you believe that energy is an enabler of human flourishing, then making it more expensive is not very good. But yeah, I mean, I've recently joined and keen to sort of inject some much needed energy realism into Westminster.
Brilliant. Well, good to have you on the podcast and good to meet you. And Max, anything you'd like to say?
Thank you very much. Yes, so I've got two hats really. So ASI, I've actually written papers on inheritance tax and why it's terrible and should be abolished. And now I'm tempted to do one on insurance premium tax, but keep an eye on what we're doing at ASI on X, formerly Twitter, and keep an eye on The Spectator, where I was published this morning on why stamp duty is bad. For the YIMBY initiative, if you are a developer, if you work in the housing sector, do get in touch. We offer stakeholder engagement services and also research.
Brilliant. Max, thank you. From a TPA perspective, I'll just make the point that some of us are going to be at the Reform Party conference in September, and then October we're going to be at the Conservative Party conference. So you want to come and say hello, maybe feature on a podcast recording, you must do so. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this week. I've been Duncan Barkes, I've been your host. If you'd like to get in contact, maybe suggest a future guest or an idea for a podcast, then you can email us. It's podcast@taxpayersalliance.com.